From a man who ran 500 classified missions in Vietnam and vanished on the last one, to a man who kept fighting for 6 hours with his intestines hanging out of his body, to the soldier so dangerous his own government spent a decade pretending he didn't exist. These are the 5 deadliest special forces nobody talks about. And after today, you'll understand why. Chapter 1. Jerry Mad Dog Shriver. Jerry Shriver completed more than 500 classified missions in Vietnam before the military listed him as missing in action in 1969. But the number that actually defines his service isn't the missions. It's something far harder to explain. It is 1969. Shriver leads a 12-man Studies and Observations Group team, SOG, the most classified special operations unit of the Vietnam War, deep into enemy-controlled Laos on a mission so sensitive that its details remained classified for decades after the war ended. The team makes contact with a North Vietnamese force vastly larger than anyone anticipated. What happens next is still debated by military historians because the classified records are still being pieced together. What is known is this. Shriver's last radio transmission reported his team completely surrounded. He told his commanders he was going back in to pull his men out. The transmission ended. Jerry Shriver was never seen again. He was 28 years old. Before that final mission, Shriver had become something close to a legend inside SOG, a unit that did not produce legends easily because almost everything they did was classified, and most of them preferred it that way. He operated in denied areas, behind enemy lines, in territory where American forces had no official presence, running missions that officially never happened. His fellow operators called him Mad Dog, not because he was reckless, but because of the opposite quality, a focused, almost mechanical calm under conditions that broke other men completely. He kept a pet dog named Klaus on the base that he treated like a partner. He spoke softly. He volunteered for the worst missions repeatedly. They never recovered his body. His name appears on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The full story of his final mission remains partially classified. The military buried his story because his story was classified. But what the next man on this list did was buried for a completely different reason, because the army initially refused to believe it actually happened. Chapter 2. Roy Benavidez received the Medal of Honor for a single mission in Vietnam in which he was shot, stabbed, clubbed, and had his intestines hanging out of his body and still kept fighting for 6 hours to pull his teammates out of a firefight they had no right surviving. Before we get to what he actually did that day, you need to understand that the Army initially denied his Medal of Honor recommendation because the actions described seemed too extreme to be credible without additional verification. It is May 2nd, 1968. A 12-man SOG team has been ambushed deep in enemy territory near Loc Ninh. They are pinned down, taking casualties, and the situation is deteriorating so fast that the rescue helicopters are pulling back under fire. Benavidez is on the base when he hears the radio traffic. He grabs a knife and a bag of medical supplies and jumps on one of the departing helicopters without orders, without authorization, without a weapon beyond the knife in his hand. He reaches the team on the ground under direct fire. Over the next 6 hours, he makes repeated trips between the team's position and the helicopters, carrying wounded men on his back, directing fire, calling in air support, taking wounds that would have stopped most men in the first 30 minutes. He is shot in the face. He is clubbed in the head with a rifle butt. He is stabbed in the stomach. His intestines are partially exposed for the final hours of the mission. He keeps moving. By the time the last helicopter clears the area, Benavidez has personally saved the lives of 8 men. He is so badly wounded when they bring him back to base that the attending doctor initially assumes he is dead and begins filling out his death certificate. Benavidez spits in the doctor's face to prove otherwise. He grew up in Texas, the son of migrant farm workers, orphaned at age 7. He enlisted in the army as a young man and suffered a landmine injury early in his Vietnam service that doctors told him would leave him permanently unable to walk. He rehabbed himself back to active duty in secret, training at night on the base grounds after hours, refusing to accept the medical discharge that should have ended his career. The Army denied his initial Medal of Honor recommendation because the mission was classified, and there were no surviving officers to corroborate his actions. It took 13 years, and a fellow operator's congressional testimony to finally get the award approved. President Reagan presented it to him in 1981. 13 years for saving 8 lives in 6 hours while being stabbed and shot and clubbed and still moving. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. The next man on this list survived something that his own government spent years pretending never happened. Chapter 3. Bob Howard. Bob Howard is the most decorated soldier of the entire Vietnam War. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor 3 separate times, receiving it on the 3rd nomination after the first 2 were downgraded to lesser decorations. There is one detail about his service that historians still argue about today. We'll get to it. But first, you need to understand what kind of man gets nominated for the Medal of Honor 3 times in a single war. Howard served in SOG alongside Shriver and Benavidez, running classified missions into denied areas throughout his multiple Vietnam tours. He was wounded 14 times across his service, 14 separate wounds serious enough to be documented, and returned to combat after every single one. On the mission that finally produced his Medal of Honor, Howard's team was ambushed, and he was wounded almost immediately. Despite his wounds, he moved through the firefight repeatedly, pulling injured teammates out of the line of fire, taking weapons from fallen soldiers and continuing to engage the enemy, directing the defence until extraction could reach them. His 2 previous Medal of Honor nominations were downgraded, the first to a Distinguished Service Cross, the second also downgraded because of the classified nature of SOG operations, and the difficulty of getting adequate witness verification for actions that officially never happened in places America officially wasn't operating. He grew up in Alabama, enlisted young, and found in special operations a clarity of purpose that civilian life never provided him. After Vietnam, he continued serving, eventually becoming a Special Forces Sergeant Major, one of the senior enlisted ranks in the entire Army, and training the next generation of operators in the same skills that had kept him alive through 14 wounds across multiple classified wars. 14 wounds, 3 Medal of Honor nominations, a service record that spans conflicts most Americans have never heard of. The Army knew exactly what Bob Howard was. It just took them 3 tries to say so officially. But Howard's decorations came after years of verified service. The next man on this list did something so extreme in a single afternoon that it almost defies documentation entirely. Chapter 4. Dick Meadows. Dick Meadows planned and led the Sun Tay raid in 1970. It was the most audacious special operations mission of the Vietnam War, a helicopter assault into the heart of North Vietnam to rescue American prisoners of war, held 70 miles outside Hanoi. Before we get to what happened at Sun Tay, you need to understand what it meant to fly that mission, because the men who boarded those helicopters knew exactly where they were going and exactly what the odds looked like. The Sun Tay prison camp sat deep inside North Vietnamese territory, surrounded by anti-aircraft defences, within range of multiple enemy military installations. 70 miles from the capital of an enemy nation that America was not officially at war with in the sense of declared hostilities. Getting there required penetrating some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Getting out required doing it again after whatever happened on the ground. Meadows led the assault element, the men who actually went inside the walls. He was first in and last out, spending roughly 27 minutes on the ground in the heart of enemy territory directing the assault and ensuring every American was accounted for before extraction. The prisoners weren't there. Intelligence had failed to detect that the prisoners of war had been moved to a different location weeks before the raid. The mission achieved its military objectives perfectly and found an empty camp. Meadows came home to a country that largely never heard his name. The raid was considered a failure in the press because no prisoners were rescued. Inside the Special Operations community, it was studied as a model of planning and execution, a near-perfect military operation undone by an intelligence gap that had nothing to do with the men on the ground. He went on to serve in other classified operations, eventually helping establish the Delta Force selection and training program that defined American special operations for the following decades. The Sun Tay raid took 27 minutes on the ground. The planning took months. The courage it required had no time limit. What Meadows did in 27 minutes inside North Vietnam was the result of years of building something. The last man on this list built something too. But what he built didn't exist before he arrived. And it changed American special operations permanently. Chapter 5. Charlie Beckwith. Charlie Beckwith founded Delta Force, the most elite counter-terrorism unit in the United States military, after spending years fighting his own chain of command to get it built. There is one fact about how Delta Force came to exist that the Army still doesn't publicise widely. We'll get there. But first you need to understand why Beckwith spent years fighting a bureaucracy that actively resisted what he was trying to create. Beckwith served with the British Special Air Service on an exchange program in the early 1960s and came back convinced that the United States military needed a dedicated counter-terrorism and hostage rescue unit built on the SAS model, small, highly selected, intensively trained, capable of operating anywhere in the world on minimal notice. The Army told him no, repeatedly, for years. His proposals were rejected, shelved, and dismissed by senior officers who saw no operational requirement for what he was describing. Beckwith kept submitting them. He had been wounded in Vietnam, had served in combat across multiple theatres, and had seen firsthand what a properly trained small unit could accomplish that conventional forces simply could not. The Army finally authorised Delta Force in 1977, over a decade after Beckwith first proposed it. He personally oversaw the selection process, which was designed to wash out all but the most capable candidates regardless of their previous military record. Physical fitness was almost irrelevant compared to psychological resilience, problem-solving ability, and the capacity to operate alone under sustained pressure. The first Delta selection course had a pass rate that shocked even Beckwith's supporters. He led Delta Force on its first major operational deployment, the Iran hostage rescue attempt in 1980, Operation Eagle Claw, which failed due to equipment problems and an accident during the planning phase that had nothing to do with the operators themselves. Beckwith was devastated by the failure publicly in a way that few military commanders have ever been willing to be. He died in 1994. Delta Force, now officially called the Combat Applications Group, though nobody calls it that, has conducted thousands of classified operations since its founding, in every major conflict America has been involved in, on every continent where American interests have required its specific capabilities. Every operator who has ever worn the Delta patch exists, because one man spent over a decade fighting the Army's own bureaucracy to build something that didn't exist. They never gave Beckwith enough credit for that fight. But the operators he trained gave him something better. They proved he was right. 5 men, 5 different wars, 5 careers that the military classified, downgraded, delayed, or simply never publicised the way they deserved. Look at what connects them. Shriver disappeared on a mission that's still partially classified. Benavidez waited 13 years for a Medal of Honor. The Army initially said wasn't credible. Howard was nominated 3 times before his decorations matched his actual service. Meadows led a perfect raid into the heart of enemy territory and came home to a country that called it a failure. Beckwith spent a decade being told no before building the unit that defines American special operations today. Not one of them chased recognition. Not one of them told their own story publicly while they were still able to. Every single one of them did the work anyway. In the dark. Without an audience. Without acknowledgement. That is what made them the deadliest special forces nobody talks about. And that is exactly why we should be talking about them.